Tom's going to
play. Yes. Oh, that's good.
Okay, again, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our fourth evening of our Lenten series. I'd like to first introduce you to our guest speaker, Father Sam Leite, and then I'll let him take us into the song. We're going to be singing. Does most people know that song? Make me a channel of your peace? Okay, we're going to be doing that in a few moments. So first, Father Sam was ordained in 1997 and comes to us from St. Stephen and the Incarnation Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C., where he was the senior priest. Prior to that, he was the vicar at another St. James the Apostle Episcopal Church in Oakland, California. He is originally from Brazil and has a unique experience of being Episcopal Anglican, growing up in a Roman Catholic and diverse country. His master's degree is in liturgical enculturation and his doctoral degree on Latino and multicultural ministries in the Episcopal Church. While in Brazil, he was the assistant dean of the Holy Trinity National Cathedral. He worked as the head of the National Christian Education Department and Youth Ministries and Mission Department. For 2 general conventions, he was the custodian of the Brazilian Book of Common Prayer. His knowledge and experience of ecumenism come not only from a country filled with religious diversity, but also for his work as the chair of the National Liturgical Committee of the 9th Assembly of the World Council of Churches. Also at the international level, he was representative for the region of Americas on the International Anglican Youth Network for 2 mandates, as well as the representative for Brazil at the World Conference of Religions for Peace. Father Sam's ministry in the U.S. has been working with spirituality and liturgical enculturation to enable Episcopal communities to engage in better dialogue with groups that bring cultural diversity and diversity of languages to the table. He got exposed to Anglican Franciscan spirituality while in the UK studying Celtic spirituality at the University of Wales in Lampeter. Welcome, Father Sam.
So good evening, brothers and sisters. And I begin this moment with this prayer that is known as prayer of St. Francis. And I hope one of my goals for tonight is to help us to understand that not everything that's said is from a certain saint, means it's from that saint. And this is one of the first signs. The prayers that is called the prayers of St. Francis is actually attributed to him. Do you know when these words or when this idea was written, in which period was done, or by whom? Any guesses? So it's from the 20th century, and there are different stories about, and probably happened after the First World War and before the Second World War, and was written in French in a magazine, and somebody did a good work of translating and working. I will send you that through Father Warren, but somebody translated to English and became a formula prayer, then became a song. But the prayer dedicated to, attributed to St. Francis, kind of encapsulates the charisma of Francis of Assisi, and is in use until today. Well, because I was thinking we will be a smaller group. I'm very glad we're a large group. I initially thought we could say our name and say one word that comes to your mind when you think of Francis. But since you are many, I'm going to just jump to the second piece, which is, what word comes to your mind when we talk about Francis? Just one word. Which word comes?
Humility.
Kindness.
Compassion.
Kindness, animals, and?
Compassion.
Compassion. Justice.
Peace. Humility.
Peace. Humility.
Love. Care for creation.
Care for creation. And I will add my own. It's complexity.
Yes.
He was a very complex man. And when Father Warren shared about my journey through the Anglican Communion and Episcopal Church, he just in the very end mentioned my connection with Franciscan spirituality. And I had the opportunity to go to study Celtic spirituality in Wales, which, by the way, you guys have a page of the Book of Mark in your parish hall. That's from the Book of Kells, is a famous, one of the Gospels in the Celtic tradition. And while I was doing these studies in Celtic spirituality, I heard about Hillfield Friary in South England. And I was like, oh, I didn't know Anglicans had Franciscan brothers. So I went to spend 2 weeks at the Franciscan house and was introduced to the First Order of St. Francis. And after being there for 2 weeks, I learned that that was not my vocation. But I knew I had heart for the Franciscan charisma. And then I learned about the Third Order of St. Francis, which it doesn't require you to live in a monastery or have the same vows that a monk or a nun would do it. So I started learning more about it. And the church in Brazil didn't have any religious monastic order dedicated to Francis. And I was one of the first persons to bring the information and help the national church to establish the formation for Franciscans in Brazil. So if tonight I get too technical about how the structure is formed, I apologize, but I want to inspire you to be curious about the Third Order of St. Francis. Let me go back to the first slide, which has the expectations for tonight. So tonight we're going to take a look on who is Francis and why it matters to know about Francis. And one of the reasons is, well, you're going to know in a few. We're going to get to know about his followers and his friends and why does that matter to us in nowadays. And we're going to listen about the SSF and the TSSF and the other S's that out there. And we have time for questions. So I promise to try to be done in the next 45 minutes, if possible. But I also want you to ask me questions if you have, if you're curious about things that I'm saying or things that you read in the Anglican Communion, in the Anglican tradition. But I also like asking questions. For example, do you know the name of the saint? You know, Francis was his nickname. What was his name? Bernardo something? Part of it? So his name translated to English is John. In Italian, Giovanni. And he became Francis because his mother loved him so much that and he was short. So she would call him Little Frenchy. And then that translates to Francesco in Italian, Francis to us in our days. So it's so interesting how the name changes. And so if there are Johns here, you may be feeling, related to Francis tonight. But I also brought a video. I want to make sure we have the essence of the saint, and Father James captures in like 5 minutes the essence of what Francis has to offer, so I'm going to use that one to help us. Let's see. Not playing. I love the video from Father James because he encapsulates the spirit of Francis, and he reminds us that we shouldn't take him with the romantic layer that the world has been presenting him for the past centuries. And he was very radical. I confess that I am I have a passion for Saint Clare of Assisi. If he was an untamed man, Claire was his center. She helped him to process things, and every time he went spiraling, she would center him, and she was very important in the process of organizing the orders and the spiritual life of the community, because the movement became so big. And they had to create a structure, and Francis didn't have the emotional structure to deal with that. His teaching was very simple, was to live poorly, to the point that he annoyed his followers. And when the time came that they had to write a rule of life, they had to force him, because he was like, I don't need to write a rule. We have the gospel. The gospel is the role that Christ have given to us. Until the church itself, the official names came to him and said, Francis, just write a role. And he does write one, and when it's delivered to his followers, they get so upset that they destroy the rule and say, this is not possible. We can't live as he's asking us to live. So he rewrites the rule. And it's very short, and that's the rule that was accepted by the Pope in those days. But Francis, like I said in the beginning, he's a very complex person, because in the beginning of his life, he grows up in a very wealthy house, and with all the privilege, and expected by the family to become a knight and some important person. And he said that when his dad was dying, his dad said to him, "Oh, I heard you went to to the Holy Land, and you met a sultan, and he's thinking that was for fighting the sultan. And actually he did go to the Middle East, and he goes to Egypt, and he meets with the sultan and becomes friends. So it's totally the opposite of the expectation of the family. Christians on those days would like to see the Muslims dead, and he does a totally opposite way. He becomes friends with what was considered the enemy on those days. And he spends the entire month of September with the Sultan and his nephew. And at the end of the time together, he says, they know God. There is nothing that I can teach that they don't know. And they become great friends to the point that who have been in Jerusalem or in the Holy Land? Raise your hand. So you may remember the Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre. One of the guardians, of the custodians of the Basilica are the Franciscans. And it's because of the friendship between Francis and the Sultan. So the Sultan gave to the Franciscans the custody of some of the holy sites, including the Nativity of, in Bethlehem, the Basilica of Nativity in Bethlehem. So some of the holy sites in the Holy Land are in the custody of Christians thanks to that friendship. Let me tell you about some of friends and followers. So I mentioned the Sultan Malik Al-Kamil. They met in Egypt. I said a few things about Sister Claire, but I want to say more. I grew up in a period of time when the movie Brother Sun and Sister Moon from Franco Zeffirelli was very popular, and that movie touched my generation like, oh, they were in love with each other. They were very close, and was never like that. She was probably 12 years apart, difference with Francis. They were good friends. Like I said, she was very centered, and she became a very good nun because she was very disciplined, and he was not. She was physically taller than him, so if he is a short man, she was 6 feet tall, which for those days was pretty tall. So you can imagine a very strong Italian woman. So she would center him pretty easily. She is enchanted by the charisma of Francis. And after his death, she tries, every time she has the chance to write letters and reaffirm what was the spirit of Francis, she would do that. And she included that in the Carmelite rule of life. What we do know about people who loved him profoundly is the number 5. It's kind of funny to see, oh, that person loved him profoundly. Brother Jacoba. Does anybody here know who is Brother Jacoba? Okay, I have a juicy story for you. She was a Roman, she was born in Rome, and he called her affectionately Brother Jacoba. One time when he went to visit the Pope, and he was trying to negotiate with the Pope about the rule of life, she invited him to stay on her court. She was a very wealthy woman, and she fell in love with his theology and followed him everywhere, and she was super dedicated to him. And her name was Giacoma. Mm-hmm. And through the process of rediscovering her life and her call through Franciscanism, she leaves everything behind to her 2 sons and follows Francis. And the legend says The Third Order of St. Francis exists because of her. It's because she can't join a convent. Well, she desires to, and he says to her, Giacomo, don't do it, it's not for you. And she wants to follow his steps. And then the Third Order is born. So the Third Order, that's dedicated to people who are people just like us, who loves the charisma of Francis, want to follow his steps, but we are not engaged in living in community in a monastery or a convent. So she was an important person in his story. And today when you go to Assisi to visit the Basilica, there is a place where this is exposed a pair of sandals and, if I'm not wrong, a cloak. Because at the end of his life, he was so intense about, I can't have things and I need to be barefoot. And he was getting sick and very ill. And she comes from Rome to Assisi, and she's kind of taking care of him. However, it's a monastery with men, and she shouldn't be there. So they have to dress her as a man to enter the monastery, and that's why comes the expression Brother Jacoba. They would know was a woman, but she was dressed as a man to take care of him. And in the last weeks of his life, she insisted with the sandals and the cloak to warm him up. In our tradition nowadays, there are a recipe of almond cookies that is dedicated to her, and when Franciscans from any of the three orders die, we exchange those cookies among ourselves to celebrate the life of Francis and the Franciscan who just passed away. But she's not the only one in love with him. There is also Brother Leo. Brother Leo, it's a very interesting case. Oh, before I say that, have you been to Grace Cathedral in San Francisco?
Yes.
Wonderful. So you may remember this mural in the cathedral. Often we go there and we are confused. Is that Claire that he's welcoming? Well, that's Brother Jacoba. That's Brother Jacoba. That's in the back is Claire, dressed as a nun. Back to Brother Leo. So when I was in Berkeley doing my studies, I had the opportunity to study in the Franciscan School of Theology, and one of the classes I had the opportunity to have was the writings of Francis and Claire, and you probably remember Father James saying that Francis sometimes was considered he was good in speaking, but he was not very literate. So Brother Leo would do all the writing for him. Brother Leo was excellent, but he also liked Francis too much. And there is this story about this letter dedicated to Brother Leo, which disappeared for a while and reappeared some time later. And we spent a time in class analyzing the letter. Let's see if I can move to the next one. That's what it looked like. It's a little bit more clear. And after his studies and researches, they discovered that the letter was not addressed to Brother Leo. Probably Francis wrote that to the Sultan, and is a salutation, and it's almost like a prayer and honoring the person. And Brother Leo was probably the word was jealous. He disappeared with the letter, and he rewrote, he added his name on the very top of the letter. It's like, oh, this letter is for me. It can't be for the Sultan. And Francis in the very bottom of the letter, he drew the face of the Sultan with the mouth open as a praise to God. And Leo, in a very unkind way, drew a cross coming inside of the mouth of the Sultan as a statement that the cross should stop the Sultan to speak. But why do we care about Brother Leo? Well, of the followers of Francis, the close followers of Francis, Brother Leo was actually the one who really loved the animals. So the tradition that we have of thinking of St. Francis as the person who cares about animals and creation, everything, is actually translated through the person of Brother Leo. He was really connected to the creation, and more you read about him, more you understand the spirituality of Francis and his friendship with Brother Leo. What am I missing here? Let's see. Tomás de Celano. So some of you may have heard of Tomás de Celano. He is a contemporary of the beginning of the Franciscan movement, and he's the one who started writing down all the stories or the hagiography of Francis, and everything that we have nowadays that are very early from the 12th and 13th century, it comes from the hands of Tomás de Celano. What we do know from Francis is just a little more than 10 letters and writings that he wrote. So he was not really, he didn't have good handwriting, and that's why he had Leo to fix things. And Claire had similar number of letters as well. So Tomás de Celano provides to the most important, one of the most important religious orders, essential amount of resources from that period of time and details. So that's why we know so much about Francis in nowadays. From nowadays, we have some famous names, and I just want to make sure we remember those names. So we do know the current Pope is a Franciscan Pope, which I bet it's a very challenging position, since you need to speak about poverty when you have so much authority in your hands. Coming from Brazil, the major Franciscan theologian in Latin America is Leonardo Boff. So if you really want to engage in the spirituality of Francis through the understanding of care for the environment and the planet, and for the poor, Leonardo Boff has the best books on it. For those who are seeking for a more contemplative experience, Richard Rohr is going to be your guide. And just recently I noticed that Desmond Tutu was a third order Franciscan for quite a long time. And just recently he changed the orders. He became a follower of Julian of Norwich in his later years, because he desired a more contemplative experience. Do you know anybody else who is also Franciscan that it's important for you?
What about SCOTUS?
SCOTUS? Tell me from where?
1600.
Oh, 1600. Who else? The other names?
Bonaventure.
Bonaventure, very good. Bonaventure is also have written a lot of the stories from those early centuries. I was trying to remember the name of the Franciscan in California. That helped with the missions. Any Californians here? Sarah, yes. Thank you. Junipero Sierra. Thank you so much. Any questions so far? I feel like I missed something, and it is. I did miss something. A question, please.
How old was Francis when he died?
He was 44 years old. He was 44 years old. And before he died, they knew he was becoming a saint. And he went on a trip. So his brothers at his monastery were not happy with him. He was not so much welcomed anymore. At least one time they left him out to sleep outside of the monastery. And closer to his death, he goes to visit another monastery and he gets very sick. And they know he's going to die. So the Lord in Assisi hear about this. And he sends his militia to escort him before he dies back to Assisi. Because wherever he dies, it becomes a place of pilgrimage. And if it becomes a place of pilgrimage, you're going to become very famous and rich. So soldiers go back, collect him before he dies, and on the way back to Assisi, they are passing by the monastery of Clare. And Clare is, she's already a nun, and she, as a nun, she's not allowed to go out of the monastery. So her last moment with him is through a window, and when the procession with his body is passing by, they open the window so she can say goodbye from far. And that's the last time she sees him. If Francis was buried on the ground, in the case of Clare, she was not buried on the ground. She is actually exposed in Assisi. Her body is incorrupted. Is that what you say in English? Incorrupted? So they found out centuries later, and today her casket is a glass casket and you can see her. And that's why they know she's 6 feet tall. But the other thing that I found fascinating about Clare is she was a strong woman and she had good theology. And in those days, the Pope was not Innocent III anymore. Now the Pope is Gregory IX. And then there is this young woman called Agnes in, believe in Bavaria, who later becomes Blessed Agnes. And she is a princess, only daughter of a king, and she's going to become very, very wealthy. Well, she's heard about Clare, and she's very curious about her charisma and her order, so she starts exchanging letters with Clare. But imagine, even nowadays, if somebody who is very wealthy and very well known in a nation, people hear about. So Pope Gregory IX heard about Agnes, and he thought, if she comes to my side, I'm going to inherit all the wealth of Bavaria. So he starts writing to Agnes as well. And it's a very interesting time because Clare learned that he's trying to pull Agnes to another order where he would be in charge of Agnes, and everything that would be her inheritance would pass to the church. So in one of the letters, she says, beware of the wolves around us. And she's referring to the Pope. It sounds like gossiping, but on those days, to speak like that about the Pope would lead you to death. However, Clare was so well known, so famous, that the Pope couldn't touch her. And she felt like she had to speak the truth of Francis to that young woman. At the end, Agnes becomes a Carmelite. But it's it's a very interesting story to remind us of the ways that sometimes the church gets wrong. And some of the saints help us to find our way back. Um, it's almost 7. I want to talk a little bit about the third order of St. Francis. So when I speak about the third order of St. Francis, I enjoy using these questions. So if you answer yes to one of these questions, you may be already a Franciscan, you just don't know yet. Right? Striving to be a peacemaker, passionate about social justice, go to action and contemplation, and for a deeper relationship with God, concerned about ecology, the poor and the marginalized. And for me, one of the first ones, which is the peacemaker, so a mark of Francis of Assisi is to promote peace. And the story of him and the Sultan is one of the classic stories about peace building. And then you probably have heard the story of the wolf and Francis, where he restored peace among creation, humanity and creation. So it's not only humanity between brothers, but also all creation of God. So if you answer yes for one of those questions, you may be already a Franciscan. Perhaps what you need is to find a group or a community that will lead you to systematize this spirit that is agitated inside of you. And the Franciscans, some of us always thought it's a Catholic thing, right? It's a Roman Catholic thing. When I went to England and I learned about the Franciscan movement in the Anglican Church, I got more involved. So in the Anglican Communion, started in 1930s. Some groups started in different times, and just because they were not really necessarily organized. In the United States, actually started in 1917. But here we see some of the information. They started in a farmhouse in Dorset, now called Hillfield Friary. Hillfield Friary also offer retreats. If you have the chance to go to England, you can still stay there up to 2 weeks with the brothers. In the United States, we do have also a monastery and a convent that you can stay for retreats as well. You can find all on the website. In the Anglican Communion, we have 4 Franciscan provinces. We have this one that we are part of it, the province of Americas, then Africa, and then Asia and Pacific, which includes Australia, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, Thailand. And the 4th one is the Pacific, Aotearoa, New Zealand, Solomon Islands. I just mentioned about how it's founded in the United States in 1917. I'll just keep moving. And in our context, in the Anglican context, the Society of St. Francis, we always think of the 3 orders. The first order is going to be the brothers. And in some places, there is, in Europe, there is a first order for women. But mostly the first order are brothers. So OSF is the Order of St. Francis. Then the second order is the Order of St. Clare, or also known as the Community of St. Clare. We have a convent in San Francisco. And the third order is the group of people who doesn't want to live in a monastery or a convent. We can be clergy or laity. The third order of St. Francis is part of the worldwide Anglican Communion of the Episcopal Church. If you are not Anglican or Episcopalian, you can also find other ways of following Francis through the ecumenical movement, which is the order ecumenical of Francis, then of course in the Roman Catholic tradition, then the Lutherans as well. And the last one is the Companions of St. Francis. And why I included this one, some of us, when we're introduced to the third order of St. Francis, we may think, this is too much. Just like the beginning of the movement, I can't do this. Well, then there is the companions. The companions is a light way of following Christ, so you don't need to do the vows that is done in the third order. And it is just a lighter way. So I have here in this table some of the information for either for the third order or companions of St. Francis. You're going to find as well the first step. The first step is contacting the formation person for the third order. He also can lead you to the companions of St. Francis. And there's going to be a convention happening here in June, here meaning in Scottsdale, in the Franciscan Renewal Center. It's going to be in June, entire week. It's from June 4th to the end of the week. It's the week after Pentecost. We'll gather all the key Franciscan leaders for the third order. So if you're interested, you can come visit. And will be with us one of the famous Roman Catholic theologians. Her name is Delia. I forgot her first name. Anyway, I will be passing the information to Father Warren. It's 7:05, and I'm aware that you may have questions for me. I know it's a lot of information in a very short period of time. Any questions or comments that you would like to share?
You mentioned that Claire could not leave her convent to say goodbye to Francis. Was that a closed convent? Was she cloistered?
She was.
So the order is cloistered?
Yes.
The
Well,
whole order of Claire is still presently cloistered?
so both Francis and Claire, they had ramifications of their orders. So even the Carmelites, there is the barefoot Carmelites and regular Carmelites, and so, some of those groups differs. So hers was cloistered, the one she was in it.
So is she part of the Carmelites then?
Yes.
Did she found the no, she didn't found them.
The Sister of Carmelo. Now you caught me.
Does it sound like it?
Yes.
No, I'm just asking because I'm extremely curious.
Oh,
She wasn't the
Claricians.
founder,
Yeah. No.
but
Claricians.
part of the Carmelite order. Got it.
Thank you so much.
Where I lived when I was growing up, we had a convent nearby, and it was the St. Francis Convent, and they had a girls' school, St. Francis Academy. And if you wanted to have a personal retreat, they had these little cabins in the woods that you could be alone. I mean, it was only a one-person cabin. And it was on their grounds, but is that part of Franciscan spirituality?
Well,
By yourself in a cabin?
when I was in Hillfield, so they do have a strong understanding of family among the brothers and the sisters. But when I was in Hillfield Friary in England, they had one brother who lived aside in a trailer by himself. But the agreement was he had to come every day for the hours of prayer. So even though he was down there by the river by himself, he had to come back and do the prayer in community, all the times of prayer. And in the case of Hillfield, they have 4 communities inside. It's a large monastery. They have 4 communities. They have the community of brothers, then they have the community of guests, then they have the community of homeless, and the 4th community is those who work or volunteer in the monastery. So it was a powerful experience. If you have the chance to find a monastery near you, take the opportunity. Other questions?
The companions of St. Francis, what is their purpose? What do they do?
They do need to follow the rule of life. That's recommended. And it's also recommended to have spiritual director. And it's very similar steps. So I would say is to create a discipline of prayer and discipline of study. Not only study of the Bible, but the charisma of Francis.
Are they scattered all over, or?
They are scattered all over. For those who have the desire or intention to join the third order, which is different, we can create fellowships. And a minimum of a fellowship is 3 people. I know we had people from San Francisco Valley in a Zoom call a few weeks ago, and I think you are more than 3, right? So you could begin a Franciscan fellowship here. The process takes 2.5 years to go through the stages of discernment until the final acceptance in vows. In the case of the companions, it is like walking with the tertiaries. They don't do the vows that the tertiaries do. And if you are a tertiary, you are more like a monk or more like a nun, just not living in a convent. As a companion, you just, the word it says already, you're just walking with the brothers and sisters. Also, the tertiaries doesn't have a habit. For the first and the second order, they have to wear their habit. The third order is a specific cross. That's our habit. That marks who we are. Other questions and comments? So what I'm going to do is send some of the material to Father Warren, and he will distribute to you, and some of the links where you can find some of those orders. And I will invite you to say the prayer for tonight together. So let us pray. Keep watch, dear Lord, with those who work or watch or weep this night, and give your angels charge of those who sleep. Then the sick will arise, give rest to the weary, bless the dying, soothe the suffering, pity the afflicted, shield the joyous, and all for your love's sake. Amen. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Ghost be with us all evermore. Amen.
Father Sam, thank you so much for being here and enlightening us to not only the life of Francis, but also possibilities, depending what some of you might be interested in, whether you're interested in the Third Order or the Companions. There is some information here on this table, so if you have a chance before you go, you can take away some information. There's a pamphlet also, and of course you can talk to Father Sam. But again, thank you so much for being here, and we ask for blessings on you and safe travel back to Tempe. Thank you.